Eliza Marsh pressed the wet cloth against her dress and watched the water in the basin turn a dark, ugly color. Her hands were shaking so badly that she had to grip the edge of the washstand to steady them. Outside the small window of the servants' washroom, the sky was still black, and the whole house was asleep. Or so she believed. She had come back to Rothmere Hall less than an hour ago, her breath ragged, her shoes caked with mud from the woods behind the stables. She did not remember every part of the night clearly. There were pieces missing, like a torn letter with whole sentences ripped away. What she did remember made her stomach twist with fear. She remembered running. She remembered the cold air burning her throat. She remembered kneeling beside someone on the ground, someone who was not moving, and she remembered the warmth on her hands that turned cold by the time she reached the house. Now, alone in the washroom, she scrubbed at the stain on her hem as though her life depended on it. Perhaps it did. Eliza was a governess in the household of Lord Alden, the Earl of Rothmere, a quiet and serious man who had inherited his title only 2 years before, after his father's sudden passing. She taught his young niece and nephew their letters and their numbers, and she had always kept to herself, careful never to draw attention. She had learned long ago that a woman of her station could not afford to be noticed. Notice led to questions, and questions led to trouble. Tonight, she had broken every rule she had set for herself. She rinsed the cloth again, wringing it out with more force than was needed. The stain was fading, but not fast enough. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain someone would hear it through the walls. She thought of Peter Hale, the young stable hand who had sent her a note only that afternoon, asking her to meet him near the old oak by the river once the household had gone to bed. The note had been urgent, almost desperate. He said he had something of hers, something that belonged to her late sister, Grace. He said he would return it if she came alone. Eliza had not wanted to go. Meeting a man alone at night, away from the house, was the kind of thing that could ruin a woman's reputation forever, even if nothing improper occurred. But Grace had been gone for 3 years now, and anything left behind from her, any letter, any keepsake, was worth more to Eliza than her own safety. Or so she had believed when she slipped out of the house after the last candle in the nursery had been blown out. She never expected to find him the way she did. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the memory away, but it came anyway. The oak tree, the lantern swinging gently from a low branch, Peter on the ground, his face pale in the moonlight, and no answer when she called his name. She had knelt beside him. She had tried to help him. That was all. She told herself this again and again, the way one repeats a prayer, hoping that saying it enough times would make it feel less like a lie and more like a shield. But who would believe her? A governess, found kneeling over a dying man in the dark, with his blood on her dress. She could already hear what the village would say. She could already imagine the whispers that would follow her from room to room, from town to town, for the rest of her life. So she had run. She had run through the trees, tearing her sleeve on a low branch, stumbling twice before she reached the edge of the garden. She had slipped in through the servants' entrance, grateful that the door had been left unbarred, as it always was until the housekeeper made her final rounds. And now here she was, scrubbing evidence from her own dress, like a woman who had done something terrible, even though she told herself, over and over, that she had not. She did not know that Lord Alden had been standing at his study window only 20 minutes earlier, unable to sleep, staring out at the dark garden the way he often did when his thoughts would not settle. He had seen a figure moving quickly along the garden path, cloak pulled tight, moving with the particular urgency of someone trying not to be seen. He had recognized her by the shape of her walk before he even saw her face in the moonlight. Lord Alden had said nothing. He had not called out. He had simply watched, his hand resting against the cold glass, as Eliza Marsh disappeared into the house. He did not know what she had done. He did not know where she had been, but he knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who noticed everything and said very little, that something was wrong. Eliza finished rinsing the cloth one final time and held her dress up to the candlelight, turning it this way and that, searching for any trace of what had happened. The stain was gone, or nearly gone. A faint shadow remained near the hem, barely visible unless one looked closely, and even then, it could be mistaken for nothing more than the dirt of a country road. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. It was not enough to feel safe. Not yet. Her mind raced ahead to the morning, to the moment she would have to appear in the nursery with her usual composed face, to teach lessons and speak of simple things, while carrying the weight of what she had seen. She wondered if her hands would shake when she held the chalk. She wondered if her voice would betray her when she greeted the children. She hung the dress carefully over the back of a chair near the small fire in the washroom, hoping the last dampness would dry before anyone noticed she had been up at such an hour. She checked her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the basin. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but there was no blood on her skin, no visible mark of what she had witnessed. She whispered to herself that everything would be fine. She whispered that no one had seen her leave, and no one had seen her return. She whispered that by morning, this would simply be something she had survived, a secret she would carry alone and never speak of again. She did not know how wrong she was. As she made her way back up the narrow servants' staircase, careful to avoid the third step that always creaked, she passed close to the main hallway that led to the family's private rooms. She paused there for a moment, listening. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock near the front door, and the faint crackle of dying embers in the hearth. She did not see Lord Alden standing in the shadow of his study doorway, watching her pass with an expression that was difficult to name. It was not suspicion alone. It was something closer to concern, mixed with a curiosity he had not expected to feel toward the quiet governess who had, until tonight, seemed like the most unremarkable person in his household. He waited until she had gone, before he stepped back into his study and closed the door softly behind him. The next morning came too quickly for Eliza. She woke before dawn, her body stiff from lack of sleep, her mind still tangled in fragments of the previous night. She dressed carefully, choosing a different gown, one with long sleeves that covered her wrists completely. Though there was no real need for such caution, she simply could not bear to look at the dress from the night before, folded now at the bottom of her trunk. She made her way to the nursery, as she always did, greeting the children with a smile that felt like a mask, stretched too tight across her face. The youngest, a bright-eyed girl named Charlotte, chattered happily about a dream she'd had, something about a garden full of singing birds. Eliza nodded along, offering the right responses at the right moments, though her thoughts were elsewhere entirely. She kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see men from the village gathered outside, half expecting to hear a knock at the door and a voice demanding to know where she had been the night before. But the morning passed as mornings always did. Breakfast was served. Lessons began. The children practiced their letters, and Eliza corrected their mistakes with a patience that surprised even her, given the storm raging quietly beneath her calm exterior. It was during the midday meal, when the household gathered briefly in the small dining room used by the staff, that she first heard the news. One of the kitchen maids, a talkative young woman named Alice, burst into the room with wide eyes and a voice trembling with excitement and fear in equal measure. "They found someone by the river," Alice said, breathless. "Down near the old oak. One of the stable hands, they say. Poor young man. Not moving at all when they found him this morning." The room fell into hushed murmurs. Eliza felt her stomach drop, felt the blood leave her face so quickly she thought she might faint right there at the table. She gripped the edge of it instead, forcing herself to remain still, forcing her expression to stay neutral, even as panic clawed at the inside of her chest. "Do they know what happened?" someone asked. "No one is certain yet," Alice said. "The magistrate has been sent for. They say it looks very suspicious. Very strange indeed." Eliza excused herself from the table, claiming she needed to check on the children, though in truth, she needed air. She needed a moment alone to steady herself before she said something, did something, that might give her away. She walked quickly down the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. And it was there, turning a corner too fast, that she nearly collided with Lord Alden himself. He caught her gently by the arm to steady her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. His dark eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through her, as though he already knew everything she was trying so desperately to hide. "Miss Marsh," he said quietly, "you look unwell." "I am simply tired, my lord," she managed to say. "The news from the village has unsettled everyone this morning." "Yes," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "It has unsettled me as well." There was something in the way he said it, something careful and deliberate, that made Eliza's breath catch in her throat. She wondered, for one terrifying moment, if he already knew more than he was saying. She wondered if the shadows of the previous night had not hidden her as well as she believed. He released her arm and stepped aside to let her pass, but as she walked away, she could feel his eyes following her down the hallway, and she understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her chest, that nothing about this day would be simple, and nothing about her secret would remain buried for long. By afternoon, the entire village of Bramwell knew what had happened. News of this kind traveled faster than any carriage, faster than any letter, moving from the bakery to the market stalls to the church steps, until it reached every ear within a day's walk of Rothmere Hall. Peter Hale, the stable hand, was found near the river that morning by a farmer leading his cows to water. He was lying beneath the old oak tree, his lantern still hanging from the branch above him, burned down to nothing but a stub of wax. The farmer had run to the village, shouting for help, though help had come too late. The magistrate arrived before noon, a stern man named Mr. Bardsley, known throughout the county for his sharp eyes and his refusal to let any matter rest until he understood it completely. He walked the grounds near the oak tree with 2 constables at his side, examining the earth, the grass, the low branches, searching for anything that might explain what had taken place there the night before. Eliza watched from a distance, standing near the kitchen garden with a basket of vegetables she had been sent to gather, though she had forgotten entirely why she was holding it. Her eyes were fixed on the men moving slowly across the field, and her mind raced with a single, terrifying question. Had she left anything behind? A ribbon, a glove, a footprint pressed too clearly into the soft earth near the riverbank? She could not remember. The night had blurred into fragments, and no matter how hard she tried to piece them together, whole sections remained missing, like pages torn from a book. She thought of Grace again, her sister, gone 3 years now, and the letters Peter Hale had promised to return. She had never seen them. Whatever business had brought her to that riverbank, it had ended before she could learn anything at all, and now Peter could tell her nothing, because Peter could tell no one anything ever again. The thought made her feel ill. She set the basket down on the low garden wall and pressed a hand to her stomach, willing herself not to be sick in front of the entire household. Miss Marsh. She turned quickly at the sound of her name, finding Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, standing just behind her with a look of concern etched across her weathered face. Mrs. Pruitt had worked at Rothmere Hall for over 20 years, and had a way of noticing things that others missed, a skill that made her both valuable to the family and slightly unsettling to everyone beneath her. "You look pale, dear," Mrs. Pruitt said. "This business with poor Peter has upset the whole house, I'm sure, but you especially. Were you close to him?" Eliza hesitated. Lying outright felt dangerous, as though the wrong words might unravel everything, but the truth was impossible to speak aloud. "I knew him only a little," Eliza said carefully, "enough to exchange greetings when I passed the stables. It is simply upsetting, hearing of such a thing happening so close to home." Mrs. Pruitt studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable, then nodded slowly, as though accepting the answer, though something in her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. "It is a troubling world we live in," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Peter had his share of difficulties, you know. He owed money to more than one man in this village, and not all of them are known for their patience." Eliza's ears sharpened at this. "Difficulties? What sort?" Mrs. Pruitt glanced around before lowering her voice. "Debts, mostly. Card games, I believe, though I never cared to learn the details. There was talk that he owed a good sum to Mr. Croft, the landowner who bought up half the farms near the mill, after his own fortune took a turn for the worse a few years back. Mr. Croft is not a man known for forgiving what is owed to him." Eliza filed this information away carefully, her mind already turning it over from every angle. If Peter had enemies, if he owed dangerous sums to a man like Croft, then perhaps what had happened by the river had nothing to do with her at all. Perhaps she had simply stumbled upon something already set into motion by forces far beyond her understanding. The thought offered a strange, fragile comfort, though it did nothing to calm the fear that gripped her whenever she thought of the magistrate's men searching the riverbank, inch by careful inch. That evening, the household gathered for a subdued supper, the usual chatter replaced by hushed conversation about the day's events. Lord Alden sat at the head of the table, quieter than usual, his sharp eyes moving occasionally toward Eliza, in a way she tried desperately not to notice. After the meal, he asked her to remain behind for a moment, under the pretense of discussing the children's studies. The others left the room, until it was only the two of them, the candles burning low, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. "The children are progressing well," he said, though his tone suggested this was not truly what he wished to discuss. "Charlotte tells me you have been teaching her about the stars." "She has a curious mind, my lord," Eliza said. It seemed a fitting lesson. He nodded, studying her face in the candlelight. "You seem troubled, Miss Marsh. More than the news alone would explain, I think." Her heart stumbled in her chest. She kept her expression as steady as she could manage. "The death of anyone in our household staff is a sorrow, my lord. I did not know Peter well, but no death should be met with indifference." "No," he agreed quietly, "it should not." He said nothing more on the matter that night, but as Eliza left the room, she felt his gaze linger on her back, heavy and unreadable, and she understood, with growing dread, that whatever he suspected, he was not yet finished asking questions. She lay awake long after the house had gone dark, staring at the ceiling of her small room, listening to the wind moving through the trees outside her window. She thought of the magistrate's careful search along the riverbank. She thought of Mr. Croft and the debts Peter had owed him. She thought of Lord Alden's watchful eyes across the supper table, and the strange, careful way he had spoken to her, as though testing the ground before stepping forward. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked, and Eliza's whole body went rigid, listening, waiting, until the sound faded into silence once more. She closed her eyes at last, though sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it brought with it dreams of the oak tree by the river, and a lantern burning low, and a voice she could not quite place, calling her name from somewhere in the dark. She woke before sunrise, her sheets damp with sweat, her heart pounding, as though she had been running through the woods all over again. She sat up slowly, pressing her palms against her eyes, willing the images to fade. Whatever had happened by that river, she knew now, with growing certainty, that it was far from over. The village would not forget so easily. The magistrate would not stop searching, and Lord Alden, quiet and watchful, seemed to be circling closer to the truth with every passing hour, though she could not yet tell whether that truth would be her ruin, or, somehow, against all reason, her salvation. 3 days passed, and the village of Bramwell remained gripped by fear. Doors that had once stood open through warm afternoons were now bolted shut before sunset. Mothers called their children in earlier than usual, and the local tavern buzzed nightly with theories about what had truly happened to Peter Hale beneath the old oak tree. Eliza tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, teaching the children their lessons each morning, walking the garden paths each afternoon, sitting quietly with her needlework each evening. But beneath this calm surface, her mind churned endlessly, replaying fragments of that night, searching for missing pieces she feared she might never recover. She had begun to notice something else as well, something that unsettled her almost as much as the memories themselves. Lord Alden seemed to be everywhere she turned. She would step into the library to select a book for the children, and find him already there, seated near the window with a book of his own, though his eyes lifted to hers the moment she entered. She would walk the garden path in the late afternoon, and find him standing near the roses, hands clasped behind his back, watching the horizon with an expression that seemed, more often than not, to drift toward her instead. It was not the behavior of a suspicious man confronting a servant he distrusted. It was something stranger, something Eliza could not quite name, a mixture of concern and curiosity that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. On the 4th morning after Peter's death, Eliza found herself alone in the nursery, earlier than usual, the children not yet risen from their beds. She sat at the small writing desk, staring at nothing in particular, when a soft knock sounded at the door. She turned to find Lord Alden standing in the doorway, dressed for riding, his expression unusually solemn. "Forgive the early hour," he said. "I wondered if I might speak with you before the children wake." Eliza rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts, her heart beginning its familiar, anxious rhythm. "Of course, my lord." He stepped into the room, but left the door open behind him, a small gesture of propriety that Eliza noted with quiet gratitude. He walked to the window and looked out over the grounds for a long moment before speaking. "The magistrate came to see me yesterday evening," he said finally. "He has questions for the household staff, all of us, in time. He believes Peter's death was no accident." Eliza's throat tightened. "What does he believe happened, my lord?" He would not say precisely, Lord Alden replied, though I gather he suspects foul dealings, perhaps connected to debts Peter owed in the village. Mr. Croft's name has come up more than once in the inquiries so far. Eliza said nothing, her mind racing to determine how much he knew, how much he suspected, and how much longer she could continue standing in this room without her composure cracking entirely. Lord Alden turned from the window then, and his dark eyes settled on her with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. Miss Marsh, I do not wish to cause you distress, but I must ask you something, and I would ask that you answer me honestly. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles pale. Yes, my lord. Were you near the river that night? The question hung in the air between them like a held breath. Eliza's mind screamed at her to deny it, to offer some smooth explanation that would end the conversation and send him away satisfied. But something in his eyes, something steady and unexpectedly kind, made the lie stick in her throat. My lord, she began carefully, I do not know what you believe you saw. I saw a woman moving quickly through the garden that night, he said quietly. Cloaked, hurried, moving as though she did not wish to be seen. I recognized the way you walk, Miss Marsh, even in shadow. Eliza felt the room tilt slightly around her. She gripped the edge of the writing desk to steady herself. My lord, I have not told the magistrate, he interrupted gently. I have told no one. I am not here to accuse you of anything. I only wish to understand what happened, so that I might know how best to protect this household, and perhaps, if it is within my power, protect you as well. Eliza stared at him, searching his face for some sign of deception, some hidden motive behind his words. She found none. What she found instead was something far more disarming, a genuine and quiet concern that seemed entirely at odds with the cold, unreadable reputation he carried throughout the county. I cannot explain everything, my lord, she said finally, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. Not yet. There are pieces I do not fully understand myself. Then explain what you can, he said, and I will listen without judgment, as much as it is possible for any man to do so. Eliza took a slow breath, weighing the danger of speaking against the danger of remaining silent. She thought of Grace, her sister, and the letters Peter had promised to return. She thought of the fragments of memory that haunted her sleep each night, pieces of a puzzle she could not fully assemble. I received a note from Peter that afternoon, she said quietly. He claimed to have something belonging to my late sister. He asked me to meet him by the river once the house had gone to sleep. Lord Alden's expression did not change, though something behind his eyes sharpened with interest. And did you go? I did, Eliza admitted. Against my better judgment, I did. But when I arrived, my lord, he was already lying on the ground. He was not moving. I do not know what happened before I arrived. I only know that I knelt beside him, and I tried to help, and then I ran, because I feared no one would believe an innocent explanation from a governess found alone with a dying man in the dark. The silence that followed felt endless. Eliza watched Lord Alden's face carefully, bracing herself for disbelief, for suspicion, for the cold formality that would surely follow such a confession. Instead, he exhaled slowly, and something in his shoulders eased, as though a weight he had carried for days had finally been set down. Thank you for your honesty, he said quietly. It could not have been easy to speak those words aloud. You believe me? Eliza asked, unable to hide the disbelief in her own voice. I saw your face just now, Miss Marsh, he said. I have spent enough years reading the expressions of men far more skilled at deception than you could ever hope to be. Whatever happened that night, I do not believe you are the cause of it. Relief washed over Eliza so suddenly that her knees weakened, and she had to grip the desk once more to keep from swaying. Thank you, my lord. I did not expect such understanding. Nor did I expect to offer it, he admitted, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth, before fading just as quickly. But I intend to learn the truth of what happened to Peter Hale, Miss Marsh. Not for the sake of the village, and not entirely for the sake of the law. I intend to learn it, because I do not wish to see an innocent woman suffer for a crime she did not commit. Eliza looked up at him, searching his face once more, and found herself, for the first time since that terrible night, feeling something other than fear. It was fragile and uncertain, but it felt, unmistakably, like hope. Where will you begin, my lord? She asked. With Mr. Croft, Lord Alden said, his expression hardening once more into something resolute. A man burdened by debts of his own does not easily forgive those who owe him money and cannot pay. I intend to learn exactly how deep those debts ran, and exactly how far a desperate man might go to see them settled. He turned toward the door, then paused, glancing back at her one final time. Say nothing of this conversation to anyone, Miss Marsh. Not even to Mrs. Pruitt, however trustworthy she may seem. If Peter's death was no accident, then whoever is responsible may still be watching this household closely, waiting to see who else might know too much. Eliza nodded, her heart still pounding, though now with something other than pure terror. I understand, my lord. He left the room quietly, and Eliza stood alone by the writing desk for a long moment, staring at the door, trying to make sense of the strange turn her fear had taken. She had expected exposure. She had expected ruin. Instead, she had found, in the most unexpected of places, an ally. But an ally was not the same as safety, and as she gathered her thoughts and prepared for the children to wake, she could not shake the feeling that the true danger, whatever it was, had not yet shown its face. The days that followed carried a strange new rhythm for Eliza, one she had not expected to feel again after the terror of that night by the river. She still woke each morning with a knot of anxiety twisting in her chest, still flinched at the sound of unexpected footsteps in the hallway, but there was now a small, steady comfort beneath the fear, knowing that Lord Alden believed her, and that she was no longer facing this danger entirely alone. Yet believing her innocence and proving it to the rest of the world were two very different matters, and Eliza understood this well enough to remain cautious in every word and every gesture, even as her fear slowly gave way to a deeper, more urgent need to understand what had truly happened to Peter Hale. She found herself returning, again and again, to the fragments of memory that haunted her sleep. She remembered the note in Peter's handwriting, hurried and smudged, promising to return something of her sister's. She remembered the walk through the darkened garden, the cold air, the lantern swinging from the low branch of the oak tree. She remembered kneeling beside him, calling his name, receiving no answer. But there was something else, something she had not spoken of even to Lord Alden, a detail that had surfaced only recently in the quiet hours before dawn, drifting up from the depths of memory like a stone rising slowly through dark water. She remembered footsteps, not her own, footsteps moving away from the oak tree just as she arrived, quick and heavy, crashing through the underbrush toward the far side of the river, where the old stone bridge crossed toward the mill road. She had been so consumed by fear and confusion in that moment that she had not thought to follow the sound, had barely registered it at all, until now, days later, when her mind finally settled enough to sift through the wreckage of that night. She decided she must tell Lord Alden, though the thought of seeking him out privately filled her with a fresh wave of nervousness, entirely separate from her fear of exposure. There was something about their conversation in the nursery that had left her unsettled in an entirely new way, a warmth she did not fully understand, and was not certain she was permitted to feel toward a man so far above her station. She found her opportunity that afternoon, when the children were occupied with their afternoon rest, and the household had settled into its usual quiet lull. She made her way to the library, where she often found him seated near the tall windows, and was relieved to find him there now, alone. A ledger opened before him, though his attention seemed far from the numbers written upon its pages. "My lord," she said softly from the doorway, "might I have a moment of your time?" He looked up immediately, setting the ledger aside without hesitation. "Of course, Miss Marsh. Please, come in." She stepped inside, closing the door partway behind her, though she left enough of a gap to satisfy propriety. She approached the desk and stood before him, her hands clasped tightly to still their trembling. "I have remembered something," she said, "something I did not think to mention before, because I had not remembered it clearly until now." His expression sharpened with immediate attention. "Go on." "When I arrived at the oak tree that night," she said, "I heard footsteps moving away from me, toward the stone bridge. I was too frightened in that moment to think clearly about what it meant, but I believe now that whoever was responsible for what happened to Peter may have still been nearby when I arrived. I may have interrupted them before they could finish whatever they intended to do." Lord Alden rose from his chair slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That is significant, Miss Marsh. It suggests you were not merely present after the fact, but very nearly a witness to the act itself." "I did not see a face," Eliza said quickly. Only the sound of footsteps, moving quickly through the underbrush. I could not tell you who it was, or even whether it was a man or a woman, though I believe, given the weight and speed of the steps, it was most likely a man. Then whoever did this, Lord Alden said, may still fear that you saw more than you did. That is a dangerous position for you to be in, Miss Marsh, whether or not it is based on truth. The thought had not fully occurred to Eliza until he spoke it aloud, and she felt a fresh chill settle over her at the realization. If Peter's attacker believed she had witnessed enough to identify them, then she was not merely an innocent bystander caught in unfortunate circumstances. She was a loose end, a danger to be dealt with should the opportunity arise. What should I do? She asked, unable to keep the fear from creeping back into her voice. For now, you must be careful, Lord Alden said. Do not walk the grounds alone after dark. Do not venture far from the house without reason. And you must allow me to continue my inquiries into Mr. Croft's affairs, quietly, so as not to alert him to our suspicions before we have gathered enough to act upon them. Eliza nodded, though the weight of his warning settled heavily upon her shoulders. You believe it was Mr. Croft, then? I believe it is the most likely explanation at present, Lord Alden said. Mrs. Pruitt mentioned to me that Peter owed him a considerable sum, and I have since learned through my own inquiries that Croft's finances have grown increasingly desperate over the past year. A man facing ruin does not always act with reason, Miss Marsh. Sometimes he acts with a desperation that leads him toward choices he might never have considered in better times. But you have no proof, Eliza said. Not yet, Lord Alden agreed, which is precisely why we must proceed with caution. An accusation without evidence would accomplish nothing but to alert Croft to our suspicions, and possibly place both of us in greater danger than we currently face. Eliza studied his face for a long moment, taking in the quiet determination etched across his features, the steady resolve that seemed entirely unlike the reserved, distant reputation he carried throughout the county. She found herself wondering, not for the first time since their conversation in the nursery, what had led such a man to concern himself so deeply with the fate of a governess who held no real claim to his protection or his attention. Why are you helping me, my lord? She asked quietly, the question slipping free before she could stop herself. You owe me nothing. I am merely a governess in your household, and yet you risk your own standing to protect me from suspicion. Lord Alden was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her with an expression she could not quite name. Perhaps, he said finally, I have grown weary of watching those without power suffer for the sins of those who hold it. Peter Hale was a young man with debts he could not pay, and it seems increasingly likely that this alone may have cost him his life. I would not see the same fate, in whatever form it might take, befall you as well. It was not the answer Eliza had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected instead. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, unfamiliar and slightly unsettling, and she quickly turned her gaze toward the window to hide whatever expression might have betrayed the shift in her feelings. Thank you, my lord, she said softly. I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness. There is no debt between us, Miss Marsh, he said. Only the shared hope that justice, however slow it may be in coming, will eventually find its way to those who deserve it. They spoke for a while longer, discussing the details of what steps might be taken next, though Eliza found her attention drifting more than once toward the quiet strength in his voice, the careful way he chose his words, the steady patience with which he approached even the most frightening of subjects. When she finally left the library, her mind was calmer than it had been in days, though the fear had not vanished entirely. It had simply changed shape, transforming from the desperate panic of a woman certain of her own ruin into the more focused determination of someone beginning, cautiously, to fight back against the danger surrounding her. That evening, as she prepared the children for bed, Eliza found herself glancing toward the window more than once, watching the darkening garden beyond the glass, wondering whether somewhere out there, in the shadows beyond the reach of the house's warm light, someone was watching the estate, just as carefully as Lord Alden now watched over her. She did not know, not yet, how close that danger truly was, or how quickly the fragile peace she had begun to feel would be shattered by what was still to come. A week passed, and the fragile calm Eliza had begun to feel was tested more than once by the constant presence of Mr. Bardsley's men, who continued to move through the village asking questions, gathering statements, searching for any thread that might lead them toward the truth of what had happened to Peter Hale. Eliza had grown skilled, out of sheer necessity, at appearing calm whenever the magistrate's name was mentioned at the supper table or in the corridors of Rothmere Hall. She had learned to steady her breathing, to keep her hands still, to answer questions about her whereabouts on ordinary evenings without the slightest tremor in her voice. It was exhausting work, this constant performance of normalcy, but she had little choice but to continue it. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, while walking to the village to collect a parcel of thread for the children's needlework lessons, that Eliza first crossed paths with Mrs. Pruitt outside the small shop near the church. The housekeeper's expression was unusually grave, and she drew Eliza aside with a gentle but firm hand on her arm. "I have learned something you should know," Mrs. Pruitt said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one stood close enough to overhear. "It concerns Mr. Croft." Eliza's heart quickened. "What have you learned?" "My sister's husband works at the bank in the next town," Mrs. Pruitt said. "He tells me Mr. Croft has been withdrawing large sums over the past several months, far more than his farms could reasonably produce in income. There is talk that he owes money to men far more dangerous than any village moneylender, men from the city who do not forgive a debt easily." Eliza absorbed this information carefully, turning it over in her mind. "Do you believe this connects to Peter's death?" Mrs. Pruitt hesitated before answering. "I do not know for certain, dear, but Peter worked odd jobs for Mr. Croft from time to time, tending his horses, running errands. If Peter learned something he should not have, something about Croft's debts or his dealings with these dangerous men, it is not difficult to imagine why such a discovery might have proven fatal." Eliza thanked Mrs. Pruitt for the information and continued on her errand, though her mind remained fixed on this new piece of the puzzle throughout the walk back to Rothmere Hall. She resolved to share what she had learned with Lord Alden as soon as an opportunity presented itself, though she found herself, more than once during the walk, thinking not only of the danger surrounding Croft's debts, but of the way Lord Alden's expression had softened during their last conversation in the library, and the strange warmth that memory brought to her chest even now. She found him that evening in his study, reviewing correspondence by the light of a single lamp. He looked up as she entered, and something in his face brightened slightly at the sight of her, though he quickly returned his expression to its usual composed seriousness. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I hope you bring good news." "I bring information, my lord," she said. "Whether it is good news remains to be seen." She relayed what Mrs. Pruitt had told her, watching as Lord Alden's expression grew increasingly focused with each detail. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the wooden armrest. "This aligns with what I have learned through my own inquiries," he said. "I wrote to a colleague in the city, a man familiar with certain circles of moneylenders who operate outside the usual bounds of respectable business. He confirmed that a man matching Croft's description has been seen in the company of individuals known for collecting debts through less than legal means." Eliza felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the fire nearby. "Then you believe these men may have been involved in what happened to Peter?" "I believe it is possible," Lord Alden said carefully, "though I suspect Croft himself may bear more direct responsibility than any hired collector from the city. If Peter learned of Croft's dealings and threatened to expose them, whether through simple gossip or a more deliberate attempt to escape his own debts by trading information, Croft would have had ample motive to silence him before word could spread further." "What will you do with this information?" Eliza asked. "I intend to speak with Mr. Bardsley directly," Lord Alden said. "Discreetly, of course. I will present what we have learned and allow him to pursue the matter through proper channels. It would not do for either of us to confront Croft directly, given the danger such men are capable of, should they feel cornered." Eliza nodded, relieved that he intended to proceed with caution rather than confrontation, though a part of her, the part still haunted by nightmares of the oak tree and the lantern burning low, wished desperately for the entire matter to be resolved as quickly as possible. "There is something else I must tell you," Lord Alden said, his tone shifting slightly, growing more careful. "I have noticed, in recent days, unfamiliar faces near the edges of the estate. A man on horseback, watching the house from the tree line, along the eastern boundary. I cannot be certain of his purpose, but given everything else we have learned, I believe caution is warranted for us both." Eliza's breath caught. "You believe someone is watching Rothmere Hall?" "I believe it is possible," Lord Alden said, "which is why I must ask you again, Miss Marsh, to remain close to the house, particularly after dark, until this matter is resolved. She agreed readily, though the knowledge that unseen eyes might already be watching the estate settled over her like a heavy blanket, cold and suffocating. She thought of Charlotte and her brother, innocent children who knew nothing of the danger that might now be circling their home, and she felt a fierce, protective determination rise within her, entirely separate from her own fear. "We must find a way to end this quickly," she said. "Not only for my sake, my lord, but for the safety of everyone within these walls." "I agree completely," Lord Alden said. "And I promise you, Miss Marsh, I will not rest until this matter is settled, and until you are entirely free from whatever shadow currently hangs over your name." There was a quiet intensity in his voice as he spoke these words, something that made Eliza's heart flutter, in a way entirely separate from fear. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the source of this unexpected devotion, this fierce protectiveness he seemed to feel toward a woman who, by all rights, should mean little to a man of his standing. "Thank you, my lord," she said softly. "I do not know how to properly express my gratitude for everything you have done." "There is no need for gratitude between us," he said, his voice gentler now. "I find myself wishing only for your safety, Miss Marsh, and for the truth to finally come to light." Eliza left the study that evening, with her mind full of new information and new fears, but also with something else, something warmer and more fragile, a growing awareness that whatever connection had formed between herself and Lord Alden over these past difficult days had grown into something she could no longer easily dismiss as simple gratitude or professional courtesy. She did not yet know what such a connection might mean for her future, given the vast difference in their stations, but as she made her way to her room that night, glancing once more toward the darkened windows and the shadowed tree line beyond, she found herself hoping, more fiercely than she had hoped for anything in a very long time, that both of them would survive whatever danger still lay ahead, and that whatever had begun to grow between them might one day have the chance to fully bloom. 2 days after their conversation in the study, Lord Alden requested a private audience with Mr. Bardsley, the magistrate, at Rothmere Hall itself, rather than risk being seen visiting the man's office in the village, where curious eyes might take note and carry word back to Mr. Croft before they were prepared to act. Eliza was not present for this meeting, though she waited anxiously in the nursery throughout the afternoon, teaching the children with only half her attention, while the other half strained toward the sound of the front door, listening for any sign of the magistrate's arrival or departure. It was nearly evening when Lord Alden finally sent word for her to join him in the study once the children had been settled for the night. She arrived to find him standing near the fireplace, his expression difficult to read in the flickering light. "How did the meeting go, my lord?" she asked, closing the door behind her. "Mr. Bardsley was receptive to what I told him," Lord Alden said. He confirmed that his own investigation had already begun to point toward Croft, though he had lacked sufficient evidence to act openly. "What I shared regarding the debts and the men from the city gave him enough to request a formal search of Croft's properties." Eliza felt a surge of hope at these words. "Then it may finally be resolved." "Perhaps," Lord Alden said, though his tone carried a note of caution that gave Eliza pause. "Bardsley intends to move carefully. A man like Croft, cornered and desperate, is capable of unpredictable behavior. Bardsley wishes to gather enough evidence to ensure a swift and certain resolution, rather than risk an accusation that Croft might somehow escape through clever denial or bribery of witnesses." "How long will this take?" Eliza asked, unable to keep a note of impatience from her voice. The waiting, the constant fear, had begun to wear on her more than she cared to admit. "I do not know," Lord Alden admitted, "though I share your wish for a swift conclusion. In the meantime, Bardsley has asked that we continue to exercise caution, and that you in particular avoid drawing unnecessary attention to yourself until the matter is settled." Eliza nodded, though the request felt increasingly difficult to fulfill as the days stretched on, and the weight of secrecy grew heavier with each passing hour. It was later that same week, on an unusually warm evening, that Eliza decided to walk in the garden before retiring, hoping the fresh air might ease the tension that had settled permanently into her shoulders over the past several days. She kept close to the house, as instructed, walking only along the path nearest the kitchen entrance, where the light from the windows offered some measure of comfort against the encroaching darkness. She had not walked far when she heard the sound of hooves approaching along the drive, moving at a pace far quicker than the usual arrival of a visitor. She paused, watching as a rider emerged from the darkness, dismounting quickly before the horse had fully stopped, hurrying toward the front entrance with an urgency that immediately set Eliza's nerves on edge. She recognized the man as one of Mr. Bardsley's constables, and her heart began to pound with a mixture of hope and dread as she hurried toward the house herself, arriving just as Lord Alden opened the door to admit the breathless messenger. "My lord," the constable said, struggling to catch his breath. "Mr. Bardsley sends word. They have found something at Croft's property. Letters, my lord, hidden in his study. Letters that appear to be from Peter Hale himself, threatening to expose certain dealings unless Croft paid him a considerable sum to remain silent." Eliza felt the breath leave her body in a rush of overwhelming relief. "Then it is proven? Croft is responsible?" "The letters suggest strong motive, miss," the constable said, glancing toward her briefly, before returning his attention to Lord Alden. "Though Mr. Bardsley wishes to question Croft directly before making any formal accusation, he asks that you accompany him tomorrow morning, my lord, given your standing in the county, to ensure the questioning proceeds with proper authority and witness." Lord Alden agreed immediately, and after the constable had been given refreshment and sent on his way, he turned to Eliza with an expression of cautious optimism that she had not seen from him since this entire ordeal began. "This may finally be the evidence we need," he said. "If Croft cannot explain these letters satisfactorily, Bardsley will have grounds to formally charge him, and this nightmare may finally draw to a close." Eliza felt tears of relief pricking at her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to appear overly emotional in front of him. "I do not know how to thank you, my lord. Without your help, without your belief in me, I do not know what might have become of this entire situation." "You need not thank me," Lord Alden said gently, stepping closer to her than propriety might strictly allow. "I have only done what any decent person would do, faced with the possibility of an innocent woman suffering unjustly." "Not every person would have done as much," Eliza said softly. "Many would have turned away, unwilling to risk their own reputation for the sake of a governess." Lord Alden's expression grew serious, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Marsh, I confess that my reasons for helping you have grown, over these past weeks, into something more complicated than simple decency alone." Eliza's heart began to race for entirely different reasons now, her earlier fear giving way to something warmer, something that made her cheeks flush, despite the coolness of the evening air drifting through the open door. "My lord," she began, uncertain how to respond to such an admission. "Forgive me," he said quickly, seeming to recognize the impropriety of the moment. "This is neither the time nor the place for such a conversation. Once this matter with Croft is settled, once you are entirely free from suspicion, perhaps we might speak more openly of such things." Eliza nodded, her heart still racing, though she found herself smiling, despite the seriousness of the situation surrounding them. "I would welcome such a conversation, my lord, once we have both had the chance to breathe freely again." He returned her smile, brief but genuine, before excusing himself to prepare for the following morning's confrontation with Croft. Eliza retired to her own room shortly after, though sleep proved elusive once more, her mind now caught between fear for what tomorrow might bring, and a cautious, fragile hope for whatever might follow once the truth had finally come to light. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, imagining a future she had not dared to consider before, one where the shadow of suspicion no longer followed her every step, and where the strange, growing warmth between herself and Lord Alden might finally have room to breathe and grow into something neither of them needed to hide. The morning arrived gray and heavy with mist, the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Eliza rose early, unable to remain in bed a moment longer, and made her way to the window of her small room to watch the drive below, waiting for the sight of Lord Alden's carriage, preparing to depart for Mr. Croft's estate. She did not have to wait long. Within the hour, she watched him emerge from the house, dressed in his finest coat, his expression composed but tense, and climb into the waiting carriage alongside Mr. Bardsley, who had arrived shortly before with two of his constables in tow. Eliza pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window, whispering a quiet prayer for their safety, though she knew there was little she could do now but wait, and hope, and trust that the truth would finally emerge from the shadows that had haunted her for so many days. The morning passed with agonizing slowness. She taught the children their lessons as best she could, though her attention wandered constantly toward the window, toward the drive, toward any sign of the carriage's return. Charlotte, ever perceptive despite her young age, asked more than once why Miss Marsh seemed so distracted, and Eliza offered gentle, vague reassurances that did little to satisfy her own restless heart. It was well past midday when the carriage finally returned, and Eliza abandoned all pretense of composure, hurrying from the nursery to the front hall the moment she heard the wheels crunching against the gravel drive. She arrived just as Lord Alden stepped down from the carriage, his expression difficult to read, though there was a weariness about him that suggested the confrontation had not been simple. "My lord," she said, hurrying toward him. "What happened? What did Croft say?" Lord Alden's gaze met hers, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, relief mixed with lingering tension. "He denied everything at first," he said, "but when confronted with the letters, and with the testimony we had gathered regarding his debts, his composure began to crack considerably." "Did he confess?" Eliza asked, hardly daring to hope. "Not outright," Lord Alden admitted, "though Bardsley believes we now have more than enough evidence to proceed with a formal charge." Croft's story shifted several times under questioning, contradicting itself in ways that suggested clear deception. Bardsley has placed him under close watch, and intends to gather further testimony from those who witnessed his movements on the night in question. Eliza felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease at this news. It was progress, certainly, but it was not the clean, immediate resolution she had hoped for. "Then it is not yet over." "No," Lord Alden agreed, "but we are closer than we have been since this began. Bardsley believes it is only a matter of time before Croft's defenses collapse entirely." They spoke for a while longer in the front hall, Lord Alden recounting the details of the confrontation, the way Croft's hands had trembled when presented with Peter's letters, the way his eyes had darted toward the door, as though searching for an escape that did not exist. Eliza listened carefully, her mind slowly piecing together the full picture of what had likely occurred that night by the river. It seemed increasingly clear that Peter, burdened by his own debts, had attempted to use knowledge of Croft's dealings with dangerous city moneylenders as leverage, hoping to extract enough money to settle his own troubles. Croft, cornered and desperate to protect both his reputation and his fragile finances, had arranged to meet Peter that night, likely intending only to negotiate or threaten him into silence. What had gone wrong between that intention and the tragic outcome remained unclear, though Eliza suspected, with a growing certainty, that the confrontation had spiraled beyond anything Croft had originally planned, leaving him with a terrible choice and an even more terrible aftermath to conceal. "There is something else you should know," Lord Alden said, his expression growing more serious. "During our conversation, Croft mentioned your name." Eliza's stomach dropped. "My name? What did he say?" "He claimed to know that a woman had been seen near the oak tree that night," Lord Alden said carefully. "He did not name you directly, but the implication was clear enough. I believe he hoped to use this knowledge to shift suspicion away from himself, perhaps even to suggest that you yourself bore some responsibility for what happened." Fear surged through Eliza once more, cold and sharp. "Does Bardsley believe him?" "Bardsley is a careful man," Lord Alden said. "He will not act on the word of a man already under suspicion for far greater crimes, without further evidence. But I felt you should know, so that you might be prepared, should the matter arise again." Eliza nodded, though the fear lingered, refusing to fully release its grip on her chest. "Thank you for telling me, my lord. I would rather know the danger than remain blind to it." "You will not face this alone, Miss Marsh," Lord Alden said firmly. "Whatever accusations Croft attempts to level in his own defense, I will stand as witness to your character and your innocence. I have no doubt that the truth, once fully uncovered, will vindicate you completely." Eliza managed a small, grateful smile, though the weight of uncertainty still pressed heavily upon her. "I hope you are right, my lord. I am rarely wrong about matters of character," he said, a faint warmth returning to his voice, despite the seriousness of the conversation, "and I have grown quite certain of yours." The exchange, brief as it was, offered Eliza a measure of comfort she desperately needed, and as the day wore on, she found herself clinging to his words, to his steady confidence, as the household waited anxiously for news of Croft's fate, and the resolution that seemed, at last, to be drawing near. That evening, Word arrived that Croft had been placed under formal arrest, pending further investigation, and that additional witnesses had come forward to corroborate the timeline of his movements on the night of Peter's death. It was not yet the final chapter of this ordeal, but it was, undeniably, a significant step toward the justice Eliza had begun to fear might never come. She retired that night with a lighter heart than she had known in weeks, though the memory of Croft's attempt to shift blame onto her still lingered at the edges of her thoughts, a reminder that even as justice drew near, the shadow of suspicion had not yet fully released its hold upon her. News of Croft's arrest spread through Bramwell with the same speed that had once carried word of Peter Hale's death, though the tone of the whispers had shifted considerably. Where once the village had spoken in hushed, fearful tones of an unsolved tragedy, they now spoke with a kind of eager anticipation, waiting to see how the matter would finally be resolved. Eliza found the change in atmosphere strange to witness. The same neighbors who had once eyed strangers with suspicion now gathered in small groups outside the church and the market stalls, trading theories about Croft's guilt and speculating on what punishment awaited him should the charges be proven true. She continued her duties in the nursery as the investigation proceeded, though her attention remained divided, part of her mind always listening for news from the village, part of her heart still anxious despite the growing evidence against Croft. It was nearly a week after the arrest when Mr. Bardsley requested a formal meeting at Rothmere Hall, asking that both Lord Alden and Eliza be present, along with Mrs. Pruitt, who had provided valuable information during the course of the investigation. They gathered in the drawing room on a cool afternoon, the fire crackling softly in the hearth as Mr. Bardsley laid out the full scope of what his investigation had uncovered. "Mr. Croft's own household staff have come forward," Bardsley explained, his tone measured and precise. "One of his stable boys witnessed him leaving the estate on foot that night, dressed in dark clothing, and returning several hours later in a state of considerable agitation. Combined with the letters we recovered, and the testimony regarding his debts to certain unsavory figures in the city, I believe we now have sufficient grounds to bring formal charges." "Has he confessed?" Lord Alden asked. "Not in full," Bardsley admitted, though under the weight of the evidence presented to him, he has finally admitted to meeting Peter Hale that night, claiming the encounter turned confrontational when Peter refused to accept a lesser sum than what he originally demanded for his silence. Croft claims the resulting struggle was not of his intention, though I confess I find such claims difficult to accept given the careful way he attempted to conceal his involvement afterward. Eliza listened to this account with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. Relief, because the truth was finally emerging, because her own name would soon be cleared of any lingering suspicion. Sorrow, because a young man's life had been lost over debts and desperation, over choices made in fear rather than malice, and no verdict, however just, could undo that terrible loss. "What of Miss Marsh?" Lord Alden asked, his voice carrying a protective edge that did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room. "Has Croft's attempt to shift suspicion onto her been fully addressed?" "It has," Bardsley confirmed, turning his attention to Eliza with an expression of quiet reassurance. "Miss Marsh, I want you to understand clearly that no formal suspicion has ever attached itself to your name in this matter. Croft's attempt to implicate you was recognized immediately for what it was, a desperate man's attempt to muddy the waters and delay his own reckoning. The evidence we have gathered points entirely and unambiguously toward his own guilt." Eliza felt a wave of relief so profound that tears rose unbidden to her eyes, and she did not try to hide them this time. "Thank you," she said softly. "I cannot express how much this means to me." "You need not thank me," Bardsley said kindly. "Justice, when it works as it should, requires no gratitude beyond the simple relief of seeing truth prevail over deception." The meeting continued for a while longer, with Bardsley outlining the remaining steps of the formal proceedings that would follow, the trial that would eventually take place in the county courthouse, the testimony that would be required from various witnesses, including, potentially, Eliza herself, though Bardsley assured her that her role would be limited, given the circumstantial nature of her involvement. After Bardsley departed, along with Mrs. Pruitt, who left to attend to her usual duties, Eliza found herself alone with Lord Alden in the drawing room, the fire casting long, warm shadows across the walls as evening began to settle over the estate. "It is nearly over," she said softly, still absorbing the full weight of everything that had been shared during the meeting. "Nearly," Lord Alden agreed, though his tone carried a warmth that suggested his thoughts had already begun to drift beyond the resolution of Croft's crimes and toward something else entirely. "I confess, Miss Marsh, that I find myself thinking less of the trial ahead and more of the conversation we postponed some days ago." Eliza felt her cheeks warm at the memory of that evening, of his admission that his reasons for helping her had grown into something more complicated than simple decency. "I remember it well, my lord. I had hoped," he continued carefully, "that once this matter was resolved, we might speak more openly of the feelings that have grown between us these past difficult weeks. I do not wish to presume too much, given the difference in our stations, but I find I can no longer pretend these feelings are simply those of an employer toward a valued member of his household." Eliza's heart raced as she listened to his words, hardly daring to believe the sincerity behind them. "My lord, I confess, I have felt something similar, though I dared not speak of it, given everything we have both been through." "Then perhaps," he said, taking a small step closer, "we might allow ourselves, now that the shadow of danger has begun to lift, to explore what this connection between us might truly mean." The warmth in his voice, the gentle sincerity in his expression, filled Eliza with a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She thought of everything that had brought them to this moment, the fear, the danger, the long nights of uncertainty, and found that somehow, through all of it, something genuine and unexpected had grown between them, something she was no longer willing to dismiss or deny. "I would welcome that, my lord," she said softly, "more than I can properly express." The fire crackled softly beside them, as they stood together in the quiet drawing room, the danger that had haunted them for so many weeks finally beginning to recede, replaced by the fragile, hopeful warmth of something new taking root between two people who had faced fear together and found, in each other, an unexpected source of courage and comfort. The trial of Mr. Croft took place several weeks later at the county courthouse, a solemn building of gray stone that seemed to absorb the tension of the crowd gathered outside its doors. On the morning proceedings were set to begin, word had spread throughout the county, and villagers from Bramwell and beyond had traveled to witness the outcome of a case that had gripped their community for so many anxious weeks. Eliza sat beside Lord Alden in the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching as Mr. Croft was led into the courtroom, his once confident bearing now replaced by a hollow, defeated posture that seemed to confirm, more than any testimony could, the weight of his guilt. The proceedings stretched across several days, with witness after witness called to testify regarding Croft's debts, his desperate financial circumstances, and the damning letters recovered from his study that revealed the full extent of Peter Hale's attempt to extract payment in exchange for silence. Eliza herself was called to testify briefly, recounting the events of that terrible night with as much composure as she could manage, though her voice trembled when she described finding Peter beneath the oak tree, already beyond help. Croft's defense attempted to argue that the encounter had spiraled unintentionally, that no deliberate harm had been intended, but the weight of evidence, combined with the careful way he had concealed his involvement in the days that followed, left little room for doubt in the minds of those gathered to judge the matter. When the verdict was finally delivered, declaring Croft responsible for Peter's death, a wave of quiet, solemn relief passed through the courtroom, though Eliza felt little triumph in the moment, only a heavy sadness for the young man whose desperate choices had cost him his life, and for the long, difficult road that had led to this final reckoning. Outside the courthouse, as the crowd began to disperse into the afternoon sunlight, Lord Alden guided Eliza gently away from the throng of onlookers, toward the quiet shade of a large tree at the edge of the square. "It is finished," he said softly, though his tone carried more relief than celebration. "You are free now, Miss Marsh, from any shadow that once hung over your name." Eliza nodded, though tears rose unexpectedly to her eyes, tears not of joy alone, but of the accumulated weight of everything she had carried these past difficult weeks, the fear, the uncertainty, the grief for Peter's tragic end. "I do not know how to feel," she admitted quietly. "Relief, certainly, but also sorrow, for everything that led to this moment." "That is entirely understandable," Lord Alden said gently. "Justice, even when properly served, rarely feels like a clean or simple thing. It carries with it the weight of everything lost along the way." They stood together beneath the tree for a long moment, watching the crowd disperse, watching the ordinary rhythm of village life slowly begin to reassert itself, after weeks of fear and suspicion. Eliza felt, for the first time since that terrible night by the river, that she could finally breathe freely, without the constant weight of dread pressing against her chest. "What will you do now?" Lord Alden asked, his tone gentle but curious. "I do not know," Eliza admitted. "I had not allowed myself to think much beyond simply surviving these past weeks. Now that it is over, I find myself uncertain of what comes next." "Perhaps," Lord Alden said carefully, "you might consider staying at Rothmere Hall, not merely as governess to my niece and nephew, but as something more permanent in my own life." Eliza turned to look at him, her heart quickening at the careful sincerity in his voice. "What are you asking, my lord?" "I am asking," he said, taking her hand gently in his own, "whether you might consider becoming my wife, Miss Marsh. I have grown to care for you deeply these past weeks, through fear and danger and everything that followed. I cannot imagine returning to a life at Rothmere Hall without you present within it." Eliza felt her breath catch entirely, tears now falling freely down her cheeks, though these tears carried none of the sorrow of moments before, only overwhelming joy and disbelief at the unexpected turn her life had taken.
"My lord, I hardly know what to say."
"Say only what your heart tells you," he said softly. "I would not have you accept out of gratitude alone, but only if your feelings truly match my own." "They do," Eliza said, her voice trembling with emotion. "They match completely. I would be honored, more than I can properly express, to accept your offer." Lord Alden's face broke into a smile, unlike any Eliza had seen from him before, warm and unguarded, entirely free of the careful reserve he usually carried. He raised her hand gently to his lips, sealing the moment, with a tender gesture that spoke more clearly than any words could, of the depth of feeling that had grown between them. They returned to Rothmere Hall that evening, as the sun began its slow descent over the surrounding hills, the danger and fear of the past weeks finally behind them, replaced by a future neither of them had dared to imagine when this terrible ordeal first began. Word of the engagement between Lord Alden and Eliza Marsh spread through Bramwell almost as quickly as news of Peter Hale's death had spread weeks before, though this time, the whispers that traveled from the bakery to the market stalls to the church steps carried warmth and delight rather than fear. Mrs. Pruitt was among the first to learn the news, and she received it with tears of genuine happiness, embracing Eliza warmly and declaring that she had suspected something of this nature was developing between them for weeks, though she had been far too discreet to mention it openly. "I knew there was something different in the way he looked at you," Mrs. Pruitt said, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "Even in the darkest days of this terrible business, I noticed it, a kindness in his eyes that he showed to no one else in this household." Eliza smiled at this, though a small blush colored her cheeks at the memory of those early days, when she had been so consumed by fear that she had barely noticed the growing warmth in Lord Alden's attention toward her. Charlotte and her brother were overjoyed at the news as well, though their understanding of what an engagement truly meant was somewhat limited by their young age. Charlotte simply declared, with the delighted certainty of a child, that she had always wished for Miss Marsh to stay at Rothmere Hall forever, and now, it seemed, her wish had come true, in a way she had never quite imagined. The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of preparation, as the household began the careful work of arranging a wedding befitting the Earl of Rothmere, though Eliza insisted, gently but firmly, that the ceremony remain modest in scale, reflecting her own simple origins, rather than the grandeur typically expected of such an occasion. Lord Alden agreed readily to her wishes, declaring that he cared little for elaborate displays of wealth, and far more for the genuine happiness of the woman who had agreed to share her life with him. Their wedding, when it finally took place on a bright autumn morning, was a quiet, joyful affair, attended by close friends and family, the small village church filled with warm sunlight streaming through its stained glass windows. Eliza stood at the altar in a simple gown of pale blue, her heart full of a happiness she had never dared to imagine possible during those terrifying nights when she believed her life might be ruined beyond repair. As she exchanged vows with Lord Alden, she found herself thinking, briefly, of Peter Hale, of the tragic circumstances that had brought her and Lord Alden together in the first place, and she offered a silent, grateful prayer for the strange, unexpected paths that fate sometimes chose to walk. In the months that followed their marriage, Eliza settled fully into her new life as Countess of Rothmere, though she never forgot the lessons learned during those difficult weeks. The importance of courage in the face of fear, the value of trust between two people willing to stand beside each other through danger and uncertainty. She continued to take an active interest in the education of Charlotte and her brother, though her role shifted naturally from governess to guardian, a transition that felt entirely natural given the deep affection she had always held for the children in her care. Lord Alden, for his part, found himself changed as well by the events of that difficult season, his usual reserve softening considerably as he embraced the warmth and openness that Eliza brought into his life. He often remarked, in quiet moments between them, that he considered himself fortunate beyond measure, that fear and danger had somehow led him to discover a love he had never expected to find. Mr. Croft's punishment, delivered through the proper channels of law, brought a measure of closure to the tragedy that had begun it all, though the village of Bramwell never fully forgot the events of that terrible autumn, when fear had gripped every household, and suspicion had fallen upon the innocent, alongside the guilty. Peter Hale was remembered kindly by those who had known him, his desperate final choices understood, if not entirely excused, as the actions of a young man, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. Eliza made a point, in the years that followed, of quietly supporting his aging mother, who had been left with little after her son's tragic passing, a small gesture of kindness that felt, to Eliza, like the least she could offer, in memory of the events that had so dramatically altered the course of her own life. As the years passed, Rothmere Hall became known throughout the county, not merely for its noble lineage, but for the warmth and generosity of its countess, whose quiet strength and unwavering kindness had carried her through the darkest days of her life and into a future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. And though the memory of that terrible night by the river never fully faded, Eliza came to understand, with the wisdom that only distance and time could provide, that even the darkest secrets, carried alone in fear and silence, could sometimes lead, through courage and honesty, toward a light far warmer and more enduring than she had ever believed possible.